thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This is going to be a talk with Chris where he is going to take you through all the aspects of making a podcast, from audio production, the equipment you get, all the good stuff, up through getting it out there. A couple of things for you. There are going to be a couple moments in the show where we are going to be like playing audio, and the audio is going to be coming off of this laptop right there. So during those moments, if you could keep it a little quiet so that everyone can hear, it should be like audible. Like I was trying to think like what's the opposite of visible? Audible. But just make sure that you're keeping it a little quiet during those segments. And also, I am sure that you have a bunch of questions for Chris, and we are going to have a Q&A time at the end where you can ask Chris anything you want to. We'll start with podcast questions and then move on to your own backyard questions, anything that you want to ask. But we ask that you keep those questions for the end. As we're going through, if you have clarifying questions, those are totally fine. Just let us know if you're like, what piece of equipment was that you were talking about? I'll also be taking notes for us during the presentation, but save most everything that you want to ask for the end of our presentation. There should probably be about a good half hour or so where we get to all of that. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I have no idea what I'm doing up here, so I'm going to do my very, very best. Please ask questions if you have them, raise your hand or something. But before I start, just to kind of get a gauge, how many people are actually here because they want to learn how to make a podcast? Okay, that's good. Does anybody already have a podcast and they just want tips on? Okay, great. Is anyone brave enough to share what your podcast is about or going to be about? You want to stand up and...
So mine is called the Sleep Rage Fuck Lifestyle Podcast, and it's about self-help, self-discovery, and I just want to share my wisdom with the world.
What? I'm already taking notes of it.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, so mine is with 3 other friends, and we're 4 first-gen millennial women navigating in their 30s, and we do a lot of closed switching, so speaking in English and Spanish, just kind of talking about life and what it is to be first generation and our experiences, and the friends that I'm doing it with, we've been friends for over 18 years.
Oh, that's awesome.
Very cool.
It's called Beer Hermanas.
Oh, nice. Anyone? Go ahead. Yes.
I have a podcast called Date Smarter Sexier. It started its 5th season, and I'm a matchmaker, so it's all about love, relationships, dating, online dating. So I'm excited to hear what your take is about growing your audience, because yours is insane.
Awesome. And I saw one more hand right here.
I started a mom group in January, so it's called Just Momming It, and me, Vanessa, and one of my other friends, we talk all things mom and things that moms don't or are afraid to talk about.
Awesome. Now I have things to download.
Anybody else have a podcast they want to talk about? Yep.
I'm a recent retiree from law enforcement, and I'm a Christian, and so I just started it. I've got 4 episodes, but I got it on Buzzsprout, but I haven't sent it out yet. And it's called Investigation Bible, studying the Bible through the eyes of a retired law enforcement officer. So I'm really looking forward to doing this, but I'm kind of one step at a time. It's been real slow for me because I don't know.
Okay. Cool. And then we don't have to like take too much time or like raise hands or anything. Can some of you just shout out things that you're hoping to learn from this? Like, are there specific areas that you're hoping I'll touch on, or things that you would like to make sure I include?
I heard growing your audience earlier. I can get that.
Equipment.
As a newbie getting started, yeah.
Getting started.
Organizing your content.
What's that?
Organizing your content.
Organizing your content. Cool.
Using AI.
Using AI.
Frequency.
How often to put them out? Okay. Frequency of release.
How to find someone that you haven't seen and you care about for a long time.
How to find someone?
Kind of to, the rock and hard place in technology.
Okay.
And writing and homes. They live through a lot of natural disasters and it's concerning.
Okay.
How do we find loved ones?
Okay, how to find
Yeah.
loved ones, yep.
I'll put like resourcefulness.
Yep.
Do you need to have a sound studio,
Cool.
best equipment?
Best equipment? Yep.
Yes, I'll put one there.
Building a brand.
Building a brand?
Copyright issues?
Copyright? Yep. Editing?
Oh, yeah.
Sponsors?
Sponsors? We do sponsors and ads.
Totally.
That feel okay? Anything else that you're like really, really want to hear about that you're going to be disappointed if I don't talk about?
Target audience.
Target audience?
Cool.
How to individualize your podcast. You know, there's like a billion true crime podcasts, political podcasts.
Hmm.
Just
How to make your podcast stand out?
Exactly, yeah. We're
Yep.
making our own.
I feel like validating sources, maybe more specific to your genre.
Okay.
So-
And how to validate sources?
I think it's target audience related, but once it's on the different platforms, how did you get people to know, look over here?
Yeah. How to get the word out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good? Cool? Okay.
Yeah.
Some of that I feel like will come up naturally in the presentation that I've prepared. Some of it I'm completely unqualified to talk about, but I'll try. And then if there's anything I haven't covered, I can go over the whiteboard at the end before you ask questions. We good?
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Cool. All right. I'm going to start with an equipment breakdown because that's the basics of like if you've never podcasted in your life before, what do you need in order to create a podcast? So this is like the very bare minimum is that everybody who has a smartphone has the ability to record audio. There's a voice memos app. There's also tons of apps you can download that are specifically dedicated to podcasting. This is really all you need if you just want to get your voice out there, you want to share stories, the basics. My best advice though, if you're going to use something like this to record, is you set it down on like a pillow, not like on a table or something. You get a lot of, you'll hear that sound a lot in amateur podcasts, totally normal, but to minimize that, set it on a pillow or something. And then once you've been going for a while, you'll learn what's working for you and what's not. I think Wes and I started our first podcast in 2014,
Yeah.
maybe. Conversational podcast where we went through every episode of a TV show called Early Edition that used to play in the 90s. It was a fun little CBS show that we used to be obsessed with, and so we just went through and talked about it. We had almost no audience.
Yeah. Brazil loved it.
Yeah, it really took off in Brazil. It's called the Early Edition podcast. And it turns out this TV show that was canceled in like 1998 is like Brazil's favorite show ever. So we didn't know, but we did 3 seasons on this. That was all the equipment we used for this thing. It has a front-facing microphone, a back-facing microphone. It's completely outdated. I think this thing was made in like 2003. It barely works anymore. Sometimes now you turn it on and it says goodbye. So we just set this equidistant between us, and every week we had a conversation at our table. I tried to clean up the audio the best that I could, and it just kind of spread by word of mouth. So you can do, there's lots of things like this. This is Zoom brand, and they still make a lot of, I think this is the H2, and now they're up to like the H9 or something. They're much better than this one, but you can find something like this that still works on eBay for like $20. So there's a lot, if you search through eBay, there's a lot of little handheld field recorders that are made specifically for recording audio that you can get for almost nothing. So I did a lot of podcasts on that and then plugging microphones into it and stuff like that to get slightly better audio. When I started Your Own Backyard, which is the podcast you're probably familiar with, I bought this just to kind of step it up, because I read this book, which I'm going to recommend to everybody who wants to start a podcast read, but particularly if you want to do like documentary style podcasting the way that I did. This is made by the producers of This American Life, which is on NPR. It's a weekly documentary show where they interview people in the field. I knew I was going to be doing more of that sort of thing as opposed to just sitting in a room talking. If you've listened to my podcast, maybe you're not familiar with my podcast. The majority of it is me walking around and meeting people and sitting down in people's houses and talking to them. So instead of having like a set up studio, I had to be able to be portable and do it that way. So this recommended this recorder, but what I didn't realize is this book was first compiled in like 2000. So this is very, very, very old now. I've lost like 3 battery compartments and had to buy old ones to replace them. It's the size of like a VHS tape. It's not portable at all. But you put it around your neck, and I did this for every interview you heard in that podcast was done through this thing.
What's the name of that one, Chris?
And this is the Marantz. The brand is MARANTZ, and this model is the PMD660. I think they're way down the line from this one now, but I think I got this one on eBay for $70. And so if you're looking to do more kind of in the field stuff, I would definitely recommend something like that you can bring with you. It's like a portable studio, essentially.
Totally.
Then you want to sit down and we'll have a little
Yeah, sure.
demonstration.
I hop over it.
It's going to be a little awkward because I'm holding this mic to talk to you, but then I'm going to hold other mics to record, so we'll get through it together.
It'll be fun. It'll be the good stuff.
You want to take that?
Sure.
I'll give you that one.
Thank you.
Take that. So I'm just going to demonstrate to you how we would do this. Wes, you can take that blue cable there and plug in your microphone. So if you have like, a few of you said that you do podcasts where you sit down with your friends and you host discussions and stuff. If you have a podcast where both of you are going to be talking equally and having a conversation, I would definitely recommend both getting this kind of like handheld basic microphone. They're between $50 and $90, I think. You can get them anywhere. This is Shure brand. It's kind of the main staple, but they make a lot of cheaper ones too.
And that's Shure, SHURE. I'll write it up there after this.
And then you're going to plug in there. Part of the reason that I use this recorder is because you can plug in external, make sure the little line is at the top.
Perfect.
There you go. You can plug in external microphones to this one. That's going to be the case with pretty much any of these portable field recorders now. It's called an XLR input, and these are XLR cables that we're plugging directly into our microphones. So you plugged in there?
Yep.
So then if Wes and I were having a conversation, we would just both be talking like this. You know, you can sit as far away or as close as you want. It really doesn't matter. You've got your own microphone. The biggest thing I recommend with this, and the biggest mistake that I see, is a lot of people will talk like this, which sounds like this. You can't hear anything. And then you're trying to edit. And then if Wes is right up on the microphone and I'm back here when I'm talking, it's a nightmare to edit. It's the worst. So independently, I sort of assist other people locally with their podcasts, friends of mine who have started a podcast but have no idea what they're doing. I edit for them, and so every few months somebody will send me their newest episode and ask me to edit it overnight or something. And this is the biggest trouble I find, is that if the two microphones are drastically different volume levels, it takes so long to try to make it sound like it's not, and at best, you still have some issues with distortion and that sort of thing. So if you're doing this kind of podcast where you both are using microphones, you're going to want to make sure that you both have them pretty close to your mouth when you're doing it, and that'll take care of a lot of those issues.
Totally. And I know that when we were using these, we oftentimes had like headphones on.
Right,
doing
yeah.
that.
And then, so the reason that we use these kind of microphones is because they have a pattern that's called cardioid. Cardioid means heart-shaped. So basically, it's picking up everything in front of the microphone and a little along the sides of the back. So, you know, you can still hear me if I'm talking here, you can hear me if I'm talking here, and it picks up around the room. They have different types of directional mics that you want to use for different situations, so that's the reason I'm recommending this one if you're sitting down and having a conversation with your friends.
Totally.
Anything I missed?
No, I think that's
Okay.
good. What do you use for narration?
So narration, that's what this thing here is. So again, this is directly about the type of podcast that I made, which is like a documentary style, is taking field interviews that I did with subjects and then bringing them back to my studio, writing a script around it, and then figuring out what I'm going to say to sort of tie the whole presentation together. You want to make sure that your narration is as crystal clear as it can be, it's as loud as it can be. And so for that reason, I use this. This is a Shure, S-H-U-R-E, SM7. This is pretty much what every like major podcaster is using right now. If you've watched videos of like the Joe Rogan podcast or these big ones where they interview people every week, this is the microphone everybody's using. The reason is it's a little more directional than this one. So I said that these are cardioid pattern. These are directional mics, so they're really only picking up audio directly from the front. So you want to make sure you're talking into them like this when you're talking, as opposed to back here or something like that. That's why in a good documentary, an NPR podcast, a lot of the hosts will talk very quietly like this because you're right up on the microphone and you can hear every word they're saying. That's the reason why. So I would recommend something like this. Yeah, that's good for that. And then, what else did I want to talk about?
The shotgun mic.
Yeah. So then, and you know, I already talked about this. Again, you can use this for any situation. If you listen to my podcast, there's a lot of scenes where I've just finished checking out a location, meeting an interview subject, and then you'll hear me driving home in the car, kind of sharing my thoughts. This is the microphone I used for every bit of that. So if you're doing something where you're on the go and you need to be able to interview people or talk directly into it, you can fit this in your pocket as opposed to this gigantic thing that you have to lug out. But then in the field, when I'm doing an interview with a subject, I use what's called a shotgun microphone. This is even more directional than this one. This is called hyper-directional. And the reason you use this in the field is that if I'm pointing this at your mouth right here, I can only hear what you're saying. And if you're talking, I'm not going to hear you at all until I move it here. And that's very important when you're recording outside, you're recording 2 or 3 different subjects, or there's some background noise. You only want to hear what the person you're talking to is recording. Highly recommend a shotgun microphone.
Can you talk about price point for some of these things?
Yeah, so this, again, this is super outdated. They have way better ones than this now. But when I started the podcast, I bought this for, I think, $50 on eBay, again. So you can find things like this on Amazon. Like, these are all over the place. This brand is Audio Technica, if that matters. But you can get cheaper ones than that too. But you'll see on the cover of this book, if you look closely, you can see she's holding this big VHS tape size recorder, and then she's got a shotgun microphone. That's how I recorded every interview in the podcast. So anybody that you heard talking, I'm standing in front of them like this. So now I want to kind of demonstrate with you how that works, because there's some rules with this that it can get really messed up if you don't do it the right way.
Sweet. Let's do it.
Yeah. Rule 1, and this is a big one, is headphones. You want headphones plugged into your recorder for a lot of different reasons. The biggest one being, and I'm going to demonstrate this for you here. Unplug that. You don't need that mic anymore.
No, I'm done.
Done. Cool. If you don't have headphones plugged in, you're going to get that, which is horrific. It sounds a lot worse when you're up close too. So that's one reason that you want headphones. Another reason, and I've done this many times before in the past, is sometimes you think you're recording, and it turns out when you get home that you are not. And if you're doing the type of podcast that I did, which is kind of a heavy subject matter, you're doing interviews with subjects, you will never ever be able to repeat a moment that you had with a person, any sort of emotion. If you say, can we meet again and just do the exact same thing, it never ever goes well. So I recommend you always have headphones when you're plugged in. But then I'm going to demonstrate how awkward this is, and this is just this goes with the territory here. Pass you that.
Thank you. I was going to say, it also sucks if you're not trying to solve a murder. Like, if you're just like, I remember we had one episode, I think of Early Edition, where we recorded the whole thing, and they were like an hour and a half, where we'd watch like a whole episode, take notes. I drove home, and Chris texted me, and it's like, it didn't record any of it, we have to do it again. And it's just like, and that's a bummer. Imagine if you have a far more weighty subject on your shoulders like your own backyard did. So, listen to Chris.
All right. So when you're standing in the field and you have this hanging around your neck and the headphones over your ears and you're sticking this in someone's face, you look like a Ghostbuster. And it can kind of ruin the intimacy of a moment sometimes. So I always try to put these on early and just have casual small talk with the person first. It's like, this is just what we're dealing with here. This is how we're going to have this conversation. And they'll get used to it pretty quick. It's a little awkward. Another big tip number 2, headphones, and make sure that you're sitting uncomfortably close to the person. I think instinctively we want to kind of give them their space. You're not going to be able to hear this at home. When you get home, you're going to have to boost this a lot, and you're going to get through the background of the whole thing. It's nasty. You have to really cozy up to the person and just get right. And then this is a person you've just met, and you're asking them very, very emotional questions. This can be a little awkward too. So, but you get used to it pretty quick. So I'm going to demonstrate for you basically how I would record these interviews, and I'm going to use Weston as my subject. So first thing you're going to do is make sure your record level is set. These ones here have a dial. You twist it. You're going to have lights that let you know if it's green, it's probably good volume level. If it starts to spike up to orange or red, you need to back off or turn your volume down. Again, that's a really bad sign for when you get back to edit. But demonstrating here with Wes, I'm just going to ask Wes to tell a story. And he hasn't prepared for this at all, so he has no idea what we're talking about or anything.
Okay.
But I was going to ask Wes to tell the story of when he and I first met. So just, can you walk me through your memory of the first time that you and I met, everything that you remember?
Okay. So famously, I'd heard about Chris a lot. He would play a lot of local shows around town. But the very first time we got to meet in person, and it was a big event, Chris had just seen me in a performance of Fiddler on the Roof in 2010. March 2010, I played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. And the show ended. I came off stage. I was still in costume, so I had a fake beard on that was hooked on with spirit glue. And I saw Chris for the first time, and I said, "Chris, I've always wanted to meet you." And he just smiled the cutest little smile. And we've been friends ever since. The first joke, though, I ever remember you making, so we were friends for a few years later, but the first moment I knew we were great friends was I asked you to write music for a musical with me, and we did that. And as we left, I remember you made this joke about Starbucks whipped cream. I don't know if you remember this joke, where he's every time I go to the Starbucks drive-thru, they're always do you want whipped cream? And it's why do they ask? Of course I do. Why would I go to Starbucks if I didn't want the whipped cream? And I'm this is a funny man. So the first event is, of course, Fiddler on the Roof. But the moment I'm this will be a friend for life was when we were whipped cream brothers.
All right. And then just to demonstrate noisy audio and things, I'm going to ask for some audience participation here. So Wes is just going to talk a little bit, and if everybody could just go, just make the most annoying hissing sound you can. You ready? Okay, go ahead and tell a story.
Chris is famously one of the best tap dancers I know, and nothing can ever take that away from him.
All right. Thank you.
I couldn't think of anything else with the hissing. My brain short-circuited. I was
It was way more jarring than I expected. Cool. So now we've recorded Wes's interview, and that's, if I had just met him at his house or out in a field somewhere or something, I just got his interview down. I usually do a polite plan for the next time we're going to talk and if we want to follow up. The first thing that I do when I leave an interview and I'm alone, sit down in my car, is I take notes on everything that we just talked about. While it's still fresh in my head, you have no idea how quickly you're going to forget the order of things that came up, topics that they said. Mainly, I try to write out standout phrases, things that they said that while they were saying them, I was like, this is good audio. What they were saying is going to be so important in my final presentation. I try to make sure that I write all of those down so I don't forget when I'm editing, you want that phrase in there. That was a good phrase. when Wes said Whipped Cream Brothers, I was like, that's probably the title of this interview. So there's things that as they're saying them, you kind of know this is great here. And then also what I didn't demonstrate, but I would do if I were doing a longer interview that was maybe an hour long, is you sort of let them tell their story first. Like, I just want you to tell me everything that you remember about this topic we're going to be talking about. And then once we get that out of the way, I've got written questions that I want to ask. But if I start with the written questions, it always sounds robotic. It always sounds unnatural, and we don't really connect in the same way. I go through the questions, and then we just kind of stare at each other. So it's best if you ask the person, just tell me what you remember, and when they get to the end, try to ask some follow-up questions. What do you remember about the room that we met in? Like, do you remember specifically where it was? Do you remember what the weather was like outside that day? Things like that. And then you can always splice those in. So part of documentary storytelling is you can take things that they said in other locations, and you think, if they would have used that adjective in their initial story, it would have been so much more powerful. You can clip it out and put it in there, as long as it sounds like it really happened and it doesn't sound like a fake splice. And I'll show you a little bit about how I do that. Cool. Anything?
No.
Yeah. Good. When you're sitting down for an interview, one of the most important things here, I can't hear anything with these. One of the most important things is the setting where you're doing your interview at. Sometimes it's out of your hands. Sometimes you're interviewing a mechanic on his lunch break, and you've got machinery noise in the background, and you think, that's just going to be what this interview sounds like. And maybe you'll explain it in your narration. The reason that you're hearing these noises is because he was only available on his lunch break. If you have the option, try to get somewhere as quiet as possible. That means every sound. Don't sit next to an air conditioner. Don't sit next to a refrigerator. Don't sit next to any appliance that has a hum. You'll never get it out. When you cut to that interview, it's going to be so annoying every time you hear it. So try it before you sit down to interview them. Just kind of walk around with them and be like, can I get you to sit over here? Can I get you, you know, it's like when you're a photographer and you're taking photos, they don't realize where the shadows are. They don't realize that they're ruining their own photo because they want to stand here, and you have to let them know as the expert, that's going to be a terrible photo. Move just 3 feet over this way and it's going to be so much better. It's the same thing that applies here. We need to sit over here. One of the best places to interview people is in your car. So I found this out early on. If you need dead silence and you have no options, you're somewhere out, ask them if they'll get in the car with you. It's also super creepy. The first few people I interviewed for my podcast, we had to do it in the car, and they told me later I was so afraid. The parking lot with some guy I just met, which I realize it's always going to be an issue, but it's so much better for recording audio. For one, you're sitting uncomfortably close already. You're already in the seat next to them. Roll up your windows, close your doors. There's dead silence in there. It really is conducive for like the best on-the-go interview if you can manage it. Let's see.
Yeah, the next thing is two hosts in different locations. What do you suggest?
Yeah,
for
let me
that?
talk about the phone first.
Ooh, phone.
So a lot of podcasts now are doing phone conversations, especially since COVID. A lot of people had to do long distance conversations and things like that. If you listen to my podcast, there's sometimes where I'm interviewing a person who's in another state, another country, and we do it over the phone. I don't know why, but every podcast I listen to has the worst phone interview audio I've ever heard. It's just everything is so noisy, and a lot of people have emailed me and said, how did you get your phone interviews so clear? And I didn't realize it was a thing until I started listening to other podcasts. I don't know what people are doing, but you gotta record. So here's I'm gonna demonstrate for you how I did this. So smartphones now, they're taking away one adapter after another. They no longer have a headphone jack like they used to. You gotta buy this little dongle now that costs like $25. And then you plug it into your phone, and then you plug the other end of the audio into your recorder directly. Every recorder has a line in option as opposed to a microphone option. You wanna plug your phone into the line in on your recorder. When you're recording, make sure that you're getting the audio where your headphones. But that's how you get crystal clear audio from a phone call. But if you're doing a podcast where, like I said, maybe both of us are hosting and we're going to share equal time on the mic, we're both talking about a TV show that we like or something. A lot of people use Zoom. That works, totally accessible and everything. terrible audio. Like, it's very hard to edit. Again, as somebody who edits podcasts for other people, they'll send me their interviews, and every time it's Zoom, I'm like, okay, how am I going to fix this and try to make it sound like they're actually in the same room? So I have a few suggestions. There's an app called Zencastr, if you can write that. It's Zencastr. Did you already write it?
Yep.
Okay, look at you. Zencastr is an app that basically has a setup where I can have my laptop in front of me, you have your laptop in another room in front of you, and it's recording both of our audio on separate tracks. When it's done, you can download them as separate tracks and then email them to whoever's editing. They have everybody's audio completely isolated from one another. Way better than Zoom. It works so much better if you can manage it. I think they have a subscription that's free when
Yeah.
you're just starting out, but it's like it caps out at 2 hours a month or something, and then you can subscribe after that.
Yeah.
Right? Am I right about that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that one is also very easy, like, in like a dream scenario, like if you're like, I don't want to do any of the editing, which you should, and Chris is going to talk about a lot, like Zencastr, it is pretty much like ready to put out like as soon as it's done recording a lot of the time. So it's really helpful in that kind of scenario.
But then the best option, if you've already gone out and you bought one of these or you bought one of these, if both of you in your separate homes have one and you can just record yourself while you're having the Zoom or phone conversation, you just scrap the audio of the phone and the Zoom and you send each other the files that you got from your independent recorders. It's super easy to edit together and it makes it sound like you're in the same room, everybody's clear, and
Like, you have to do the clap test for that though, right?
right, so if you're both recording it on separate recorders, you got to make sure you do some kind of clap so you can sync them later, and you'll see when I show you, when you have your WAV file, you'll see where the clap spikes, and you want to line those perfectly up so that they're both in sync with each other.
Yeah, and what that literally is, it's just like the other person when I've done this, it's just saying at the same time, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you start. It's just a helpful reference point to know when to start all the audio. It's a clear spike in Audacity, which we're going to show in just a little bit, but it's that easy.
All right. So the next step is when I've done my field interview. I'm leaving. I've taken my notes on what the interview was like. I've got to go home then, and I've got to figure out what I'm going to say. This is, again, in a documentary-style podcast, my narration is doing all the storytelling to get you from one interview to the other. What I like to do, and I'll show you what I did here, is just lay out visually scene cards for everything I know I want to talk about in an episode. So before I even start my podcast, if you're going to be, like, again, this is for documentary style podcasting, if you're going to be telling a story, you want to know what each episode is trying to achieve. You want to know what you're trying to get to. And so when I laid out my episodes before I even set out to do them, I had these color-coded index cards. This is probably way too much, like you don't need to go this far, but I like to. I had my cold open, basically how I was going to start the episode, what I was going to say. I had a theme song that would come in after that, and then I would go into my narration. So each of the yellow cards here are topics that I wanted to cover in chronological order in my narration, basically just to get me to the purple cards. So the purple cards are recorded interviews with people, whether they've been phone or in person. These are the pieces that are going to tie this episode together, and my narration has to get you chronologically from one to the other. So I would try to lay that out in script format, and I like to see it laid out in front of me. So I did it like this. You got narration, you've got your first interview here. You've got narration that gets you to other topics to get you to this interview here. Green was when I had tape. So basically anything that I had found on the internet, a recording of somebody being interviewed somewhere else that I didn't do, somebody who was on the news, or a lot of times I'll do field audio. So I would go to the ocean, I would go stand in the middle of the woods and just point my microphone up and get some ambient sounds, because it helps visually to put a story together. So those were the green cards. The yellow gets you back again to this last purple interview, and then how you're going to close that episode. So a layout like this is for like a 45-minute to 1 hour episode, and I did this for every episode of Your Own Backyard. And then I know some people asked, let's see what we had. Resourcefulness, how to find people, tools that you can use for that. Again, I can go more into depth about this if there's anybody that has specific questions. But I used a site called newspapers.com. It's super accessible. I'll show you here. you can subscribe to this, and you can type in any keyword you want, and it will show you every newspaper that's ever been archived that has those words in it. You can sort them geographically, if you just want ones from Santa Barbara County. If you just want ones from 2001 to 2004, you can narrow everything down specifically. You can put things in quotes. So if I'm searching for my name, Chris Lambert, I'm going to get everything that has the words Chris or Lambert on the page. If I put them in quotes, it's only going to give me when Chris and Lambert are together as one name. This was like the most helpful resource in trying to tell a story documentary style and counting on other people's reporting to do it. So newspapers.com, I think you can subscribe for like $12 a month or something, and it's been like the best use of my money. I would highly recommend. The library here also has a reference desk upstairs. There's somebody who's sitting behind a desk every day, and they're just waiting for you to come in and ask them questions, and I don't think anybody ever does. So I think you should utilize that as much as possible. They're being paid. Okay, this is you. That's you. Go find her. And yeah, I mean, your entire job is to find information for people that they can't find themselves. And they're experts at it. They do it really, really well. They know all the places to look. If you think you've tapped out a resource, you can't find contact info for somebody, you can't find historically where did this building used to be before it moved downtown, they can find all that sort of stuff. So, and they're free. They don't even charge you, so I recommend that. All right, so I finished my interview in the field with Wes, right? We got Wes's whole story about how we met, and now I'm going to tie it together with my narration about how we met. And like I said, to do that, I used this microphone here. This is really hard to do with one hand.
If you need me to be a hand, I can be a hand free.
So this is what I used to record my narration here. Again, like I said, during COVID, a lot of people realized that they had to learn how to record at home. It's really not all that hard. You can do, I think somebody asked earlier, do you need to have your own home studio? Do you need to have a sound studio? Absolutely not. I had to do this on the run. I had to do this when I was traveling. Throw a blanket over your head, sit in a closet somewhere, find a small space that doesn't echo. I mean, literally take your vacuum out of your closet, sit down, throw a blanket over your head, and record under there. You get great sound. And again, your car works really, really well for that kind of stuff.
Do you want to show them the picture of what your sound studio looked like
Yeah,
in
yeah.
your own backyard?
So that, yeah, if you think you need access to a sound studio, the entire season of Your Own Backyard was recorded at this table.
Yeah, the dining room table of their house.
And directly out this window is the Santa Maria Airport. So really not the best place for recording, and most people I don't think could tell the difference. So as long as you're up close on your microphone, you wait for planes to land, and if you need to, throw a blanket over your head, you cut out a lot of background noise.
Also, one thing we put out of our mind was that room would get very hot, like at certain times of the day, and recording without a fan in the room, doing audio, not fun, but it happened.
But important, because
Yeah.
you want silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the tough part. I forgot to mention it was upstairs next to the airport.
Yeah.
Get these on here. There's a lot of tangling going on here, but that's okay. So hello, check, 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 1, 2, 1, 2. I'm just dialing up the audio until it's closer to yellow or orange with the lights, and then just back it off just a little bit from that. And this is about how close I am. This is just a little tip that I learned along the way. If you talk directly like this, you're gonna hear a lot of, no matter what. I have this windsock on, you'll still hear it. Turn it at a 45-degree angle and talk through it. Talk like you're talking forward. That's a little trick I learned. So I knew I was going to be asking Wes how we met. So I went ahead and wrote up a little script of my introduction to the segment with him about how we met. So I'm gonna record that in front of you. This is really annoying too. If you're not hydrated, you hear every little. That's the worst. You can't cut around it either. Okay. The first time I met Weston Scott, it was the spring of 2010, and it was pouring rain. My friend Allie, who would later become my girlfriend, had invited me to see a production of Fiddler on the Roof at Santa Maria High School. I had heard about Weston through mutual friends. He was boisterous, animated, and the lead in pretty much every high school production because of a supernatural ability to memorize all of his lines overnight. The play is kind of a blur now, but what I remember is when it was over, Weston stepped off the stage to thank his friends for coming, and through the crowd, we locked eyes for the first time. And that's it. So the trick is going to be to splice those two things together. My narration, which ends right where Weston's narration or interview is going to begin. Wes, you can sit down again.
Oh, good.
I just wanted to show you this, because this is, like, you really can't beat yourself up about this stuff. I had, for my podcast, sometimes I had to be doing that for like an hour or 2 hours. It takes a long, long time if you're doing a lot of reading. What I just did in front of you, you saw I had to stop once or twice to kind of clear my throat or get some spit in my mouth again. This is my experience with recording. And looked around at each other, confused, as they filed back into the deliberation room, into the deliberate. As they filed back into the deliberation room. As they filed back into the deliberation room. Paul's jury was led out of the So that's the majority of your editing work is going to be getting through that kind of stuff and not hating yourself by the end of it. Can you take the mic back?
Yeah.
You just sort of walk them through what I'm doing.
Cool. So right now, what we are about to do is go on a little bit of an editing journey. So Chris has done the narration. He's got my interview, which is way wilder than I thought it would be. And he is going to be opening up a program called Audacity right now. How many of you have heard of this program or use it? Yes. There are many editing softwares for audio. Audacity is the one I'm most familiar with because it is free and it is very user-friendly. He is going to be showing the editing process for that, clearing some stuff out. It is very simple to do. The web address, and I will write it after we get into the editing part a little bit, is audacityteam.org. I cannot recommend it enough. There are other ones that are super great, and I'm sure there are some that are even more user-friendly, but probably cost a little bit of money. Audacity is what I've always used for my podcasts, and I know it's what Chris uses. Want the mic back?
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you. Right. Yeah, Audacity, the reason I'm demonstrating on Audacity is because, again, it's free. It's the great equalizer. Everyone has access to this. Everyone can use it. It's very easy to explain. There are better programs out there that have a lot more options, but they're really not necessary. A lot of times when I was in a different location or I had to edit something quickly, I was doing it on a laptop very simply, as opposed to my recording studio, which I have in my backyard. I have Pro Tools. I've recorded albums back there. I do a lot of sound production stuff. Audacity works pretty much just as well. There's very, very rarely a time where I find there's something I can't already do on that. So I've taken the card out of my field recorder. This is called a CF card. This is where all my data is on now. And I'm just going to pull up the interview I did with Wes here.
I don't want to hear it again.
One thing I didn't do here is notate the numbers of files that I was recording. So a few times I stopped and started, and now I've got to dig around to figure out which one was Wes. Which I believe was that one there. All right. Great, this is perfect.
I see the blue lines.
So Wes is really used to this part. When Wes and I do a podcast together, remember what I was telling you earlier about the difference between your voices? Wes is the loudest person you've ever met. And I'm probably the quietest. So you'll
Let's
notice,
call the whole thing off.
you'll notice this gigantic spike here when Wes first started talking.
Okay. So famously, I'd heard about Chris a lot. He would play a lot of local shows around town.
So that's way too loud. And so as he was talking, I was dialing back the audio. It's always best if you don't ask them an important question right away and start recording. Just get them to talk about what they had for breakfast that day is usually what I do, or like what they did before they came to the interview. I always started my podcast prior to this. I would ask every guest, what did you listen to on the drive to my house? And then while they're talking, you're just dialing in audio because there's almost nothing they're going to say in that that's going to be make it or break it. So this part about Wes talking about my shows, who cares, right? That's not important. So I'm going to get rid of all that anyway.
But the very first time we got to meet in person, and it was a big event, Chris had just seen me in a performance of Fiddler on the Roof in 2010. March 2010, I played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, and the show ended. I came off stage. I was still in costume, so I had like a fake beard on that was like hooked on with spirit glue, and I saw Chris for the first time, and I said,
You remember you guys all laughed at the spirit glue line, but you can't hear you, right? So that's part of the shotgun microphone magic, is that I'm not pointing it at you. It's really great. So I'm going to pull up my narration that I did here and start getting this together.
had just seen me in a
The first time I met Weston Scott, it was
Can you
the
guys hear
spring
that
of
without the mic,
2010,
or is it better like this?
and it was pouring rain.
It's better.
My
like that.
friend Allie.
All right. So I'm going to get rid of my little start at the beginning.
At Santa Maria High School. I had heard about Weston through mutual
So-
friends overnight.
You can see this little blip
Friends
here.
overnight.
That's when I was clearing my throat. Just delete it. Just highlight and delete it.
Overnight. The play is kind of a blur now. For coming. And through the crowd, we locked eyes for the first time.
So that's where I'm going to go into Wes's interview, and I know that here. And I'm going to start here.
The first time I met Wes,
I always take the beginning of audio here, and you know, you can figure all this stuff out online, but I'll sort of walk you through what I'm doing step by step. I'm going to fade the beginning in so that whatever audio was before it, or if you have some background noise like wind or whatever, it doesn't just jump in all of a sudden. It fades in
the first
quietly,
time I met,
and then I fade the end out. So, yeah.
Wes for the first time.
Just do a fade out there. So that's my narration point. We're going to go back to Wes.
Chris had just seen me in a performance of Fiddler on the Roof
See, I already said that, so that's superfluous. I don't need that there.
in 2010, March 2010.
I said that.
And the show ended. I came off stage.
So that's the first thing Wes says that's actually like important to what I want to use this for.
Right. I'm just crossing my fingers to see if Whipped Cream Brothers makes the final cut. Off stage, I was still in costume, so I had like a fake beard on that was like hooked on with spirit glue. And I saw Chris for the first time, and I said, "Chris, I've always wanted to meet you." And he just smiled the cutest little smile. And we've been friends ever since.
So I'm going to get rid of that little break there.
Cutest little smile. We've been friends ever since. So the first event is "This Will Be a Friend for Life" was when we were Whipped Cream Brothers.
Sadly, I'm not going to use that there.
Like, that's okay. I'll keep it in my heart.
All right, so I'm going to start with my narration here.
The first time I met Weston Scott, it was the spring of 2010.
I'm going to paste Wes's interview in here. And then you can see, like, you see how big this gray rectangle is, and you see how the blue spikes are sort of in there. You can get all the way up to the edges of it before it starts to get distorted. So you can, this is one of the good things about Audacity. It tells me the exact volume level I can turn it up before it goes distorted. So you can,
The first time I met
it's way
Weston
louder now,
Scott,
right?
It was the spring of 2010.
I usually do that, and then I do what's called limiting, which means that sometimes there's little plosives and sounds like that in there. I don't want them in there, and you want to get basically just the average level of what your audio is all the way across. So you do what's called limiting, and I forget where that's at. There we go. And what I'm doing here is I'm just telling it how far I want it to limit the audio. And if you watch my little block at the bottom there, you see how it trimmed off all those spikes? Those are not necessary spikes anyway. Occasionally you listen back and you realize actually that really messed the audio up, but most of the time when it's just dialogue, it won't.
I had heard about Weston
You
through
can't tell the
mutual
difference,
friends.
right? And then I'm going to do the same with Wes's. I'm going to turn him up. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to turn him up as loud as mine. So mine had about 5.7, I think, decibels of headroom. Wes's only has 3.7. I'm going to turn it up, and I'm going to trim off the top again. And all the spikes disappear. So what I did is I prepared, I talk about how when I met Wes, it was raining outside. So I went ahead and I recorded some field audio the last time it rained. So I'm going to use that as a visual when I'm telling the story of how we met. So I'm going to wait till I mention the rain.
Spring of 2010, and it was pouring rain. Pouring rain.
So the rain
My
comes
friend
on top of
Allie,
that.
who would later become my girlfriend, had invited me to see a production of Fiddler on the Roof at Santa Maria High School. I had heard about Weston.
See, there's a little bit of a scene change there where I'm talking about, we're going to this together and it's raining outside. But now I'm going to switch the scene and I'm talking about Wes and what I had heard about him. The rain's not important anymore, so I'm going to trim. To trim, you just press Control-I. You'll figure all this out as you get used to this program and stuff. But I've got the rain coming in there. Again, I'm going to fade it in just slightly when I first start talking about it. And then
On the Roof at Santa Maria High School.
I'm going to fade it out about there. And then I also just made some ambient music, just some very basic. It's way, way, way too loud. So I'm going to just bring the volume level down. I want it to be negative 20 decibels from where it is right now, so you can still see it in there.
The first time I met Weston Scott,
That first little breath is usually where I like to bring the music in.
it was the spring of 2010, and it was pouring rain. My friend Allie, who would later become my girlfriend, had invited me to see a production of Fiddler on the Roof at Santa Maria High School. I had heard about Weston through mutual friends. He was boisterous, animated, and the lead in pretty much every high school production because of a supernatural ability to memorize all of his lines overnight. The play is kind of a blur now, but what I remember is when it was over, Weston stepped off the stage to thank his friends for coming, and through the crowd, we locked eyes for the first time.
I came off stage. I was still in costume, so I had like a fake beard on that was like hooked on with spirit glue. And I saw Chris for the first time, and I said, "Chris, I've always wanted to meet you." And he just smiled the cutest little smile. We've been friends ever since.
So that's it. That's So obviously we're kind of limited for time, but you can imagine this is what I would do with an hour-long episode. It's just one interview, back to narration, back to interview. Again, when you sit there and you do the narration for like an hour straight, you're going to have an hour-long file of you narrating. So when you get to a part that you don't need because you're cutting to an interview, splice it with Command-I and just copy and paste it somewhere else. It's very easy to do. That's why I like Audacity. It's so visual and you can see where you're moving stuff. As I'm playing it, there's points where I feel like the music was getting a
Weston
little
stepped
too
off
loud.
the stage to thank his friends
You
for
just
coming,
drag the volume down here,
and through the
turn it
crowd,
up
we locked eyes for the first time.
till you dial in the correct levels and all that. And then when we get to the end of Wes's story here,
Smile. We've been friends ever since.
we'll just call that the end of the story there. So I'm going to fade out the ending.
Cutest little smile. We've been friends ever since.
That's basically your transition to whatever the next scene is. That's where I would typically use field audio. I would take my shotgun mic and go to a forest in the morning. I'd get birds chirping. I'd go down to the beach. I'd get the ocean waves crashing. And then I'd edit those in between scenes like that, so you get kind of a swipe to where the next scene is going to come in. I also use music for that.
And one thing about Chris also is that Chris is a genius, and it's frustrating because he also composes his own music. There's a lot of royalty-free music that you can use to do these transitions. Like if you look for it, you'll find things that you can use without worrying about copyright, without paying people, or it's like you pay one time like 99 cents and then you get to use it. Or you can just be able to do everything and compose your own music. That also happens during the podcast like Chris does.
Can I ask, do you script out every word of your narration and read it off of your laptop or a piece of paper, or do you improvise it all?
Yeah, I write almost every word. There are occasionally times where I get to a point where I'm thinking, I can tell this isn't quite as clear as I can be, or I used this phrase too many times and I didn't realize it till I was reading it out loud. Where on the fly I'll change a word here or there, but the majority of it I script beforehand. That was the frustration. I don't know if any of you were following along with my podcast, especially when I was covering the trial. So when we got to the trial, people were like beating my door down for where is the next episode. And I have to type every word that I'm going to be reading. Then I've got to record it all, which takes an hour or two. Then I've got to edit all of it, and sometimes I stumble and I have to get my way through. Then I've got to compose the music for it. If I'm doing interviews, I've got to collect the interviews. Sometimes people say, sorry, I'm not available today, can we do Thursday? And then you have people going, where is your new episode? And it's like, this is, that's just part of the game.
How many years did it take you to do the first 6 episodes again?
I think it was about, I think I spent about 6 months on the first few episodes. Yeah. And then as they were coming out in real time, it was like, when I released Your Own Backyard, right, yeah. I had very little expectation of what it was going to do as far as downloads. If you're like looking for tips from me about like how do I get more downloads, I have no idea. Sometimes it just happens that way. I had a podcast for 3 years where I interviewed artists and creative types at my dining room table. Every week, every Tuesday, I put out a brand new episode, and it usually topped out around 1,000 or 2,000 downloads, which is decent locally, and it got a following locally. But when I put out the first episode of Your Own Backyard, the first week it got 75,000 downloads. And I Googled that number, and it turns out that puts you in like the top 1% of every podcast in the world. And I thought, okay, now the pressure's really on because I've got to get another one out next week. And I didn't think this many people were going to be paying attention. Also, as I started putting it out, because I did an investigative podcast, people who heard the first episode would be like, I was part of this, like I remember this, I really have something important to share. So we would have to schedule an interview, and I would have to get that in to the episode that was about to drop the following week. So that became pretty difficult. I would highly recommend, this is advice I give for everybody with making music, with making podcasts, don't announce it. Just don't tell anybody you're doing it. Just work on it in private. I worked on this from I think May of 2018 till February of 2019 before I finally put out a trailer that said there's a podcast about this case coming out soon. And almost an entire year had passed where I was working secretly and I wasn't telling anybody I was doing it. But the main reason for that is you find, as you do this over and over again, once you announce it and people react to it, especially on social media, they like it, they comment on it, it sort of drains you of all the excitement that you had about putting it out. Because you're like, I already got the fix. I got what I was looking for. I've done this for albums in the past where I'm working on an album. You announce it a little too early, and then you just find yourself drained. And you're like, I already got the exciting part. I don't really want to finish it now. And I see way too many people do this locally. Almost everybody who's come to me and said, I want to start a podcast, do you have advice? I give them this advice, and they go home and they announce it like almost immediately. So that's my number one, above everything else I'm telling you here today, just work in private for as long as you can manage it before you tell anybody out loud, especially the internet, I have a podcast coming. Because once you do that, the clock starts ticking, and it also drains you of all the enthusiasm you had up to that point. Again, let's go back to the music here. As Wes mentioned, I scored my own podcast, but that's only because I'm a musician first and foremost before even podcasting. And so I like to make the music. I play every instrument and sit with it for a long time before the episode is done because I want to make sure to score it emotionally and get everything. But there are a lot of royalty-free sites and places where you can get free music. You can type in and specifically what you're looking for: true crime, suspense, theme music, royalty-free. You'll find all kinds of things. But like, for instance, when I made this podcast, I knew I wanted a theme song that was very like hard-hitting and like you would want to hear repeated. You would get excited when it came in. So I like hired a session cellist and I booked some studio time and worked on that. And then you get reviews like this. It's well done for the most part. The theme music is the worst in all of podcasting. So that's amongst the good stuff. There's always stuff like that. And then again, as I mentioned, you heard me edit in the rain sounds. I told you sometimes I wake up at 5 a.m. and I would go to a forest. I would go somewhere in the woods and I would just try to get ambient audio, and I would spend a lot of time doing it. And every knock on the door and things like that. And then people will leave you reviews that say, please, 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 please stop doing the beep, boop, bop sound effects while describing a phone call, the rewind sound effects, text notifications, etc. This is such a great piece of true crime reporting, great production quality, excellent interviews, and host has a great voice for radio. But I wish so much as a whole podcast could stop these, haha, this is what a phone sounds like in case you forgot, constant barrage of unnecessary background jingling. Leave the sound effects to morning shock jock radio as it's unneeded, unwanted, played out, beyond overdone. We can stop there. So yeah, everything you do that you put out on the internet is going to get some response like this. I think last I looked, I had to stop checking because it does a lot of emotional damage sometimes. Last I checked, I think I had like 25,000 reviews, and like 24,900 of them are 5-star reviews saying, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard, but I could tell you every word of the 1-star reviews because I read them over and over again. So there's always that. And then sometimes no matter how hard you work, you get ones like this. Chris, your podcast actually made a change. You will always be remembered as someone who changed the outcome of this tragic story. Thank you. 2 stars. So anyway, we've got the sound effects. We talked about the sound effects. We talked about the music. I've got it. I like it. I don't care if anybody else likes it. So that's how I'm going to put it together. We're going to export this file. You want to export as a WAV. That's the highest uncompressed file type that you're going to use for audio. I don't care what we call it. We're just going to export it there. And so this now right here is my finished podcast with Wes and I. Narration, interview, music, and sound effects. Now you got to figure out how you're going to get it out into the world. So there's many options these days. The first one that most people are using now is just YouTube. And YouTube is trying really hard. I've spoken to people at YouTube who are like, can you put your podcast on our site? Because we're trying to let people know podcasting is welcome on YouTube. Like, we really want people to start there. So you can take your audio directly and just upload it straight to your YouTube channel. A lot of people, even, my podcast got millions and millions of downloads, and every day somebody comments and says, I looked all over YouTube, where is it? So people are going to YouTube looking for podcasts. That's probably the easiest way to do it. There's also, if you want to be writing these down, YouTube. Yeah. There's also SoundCloud. SoundCloud is like YouTube, but it's just for audio. There's no video to go along with it. You can upload music, you can upload podcasts, you can upload anything like that. That way you can just take that link and you can post it to your social media and say, if you want to listen to my podcast, here it is right now. You just click the play button. It's as simple as can possibly be. But if you want to get it out to a mass audience, which some people do, you have to find a hosting site. That's because each file that you upload and post out into the world is taking up space on somebody's hard drive somewhere, right? So if you pay to host, I use a website called Libsyn, which stands for Liberated Syndication. It's super user-friendly. You press new and you click upload audio, and then you click publish, and it's everywhere. It goes to Apple Podcasts, it goes to Spotify, it goes to Google Podcasts, it goes everywhere that people are looking for their podcasts. And there's also a lot of sites. Somebody mentioned Buzzsprout earlier, I think. There's Podbean. A lot of them are bean themed for some reason. I don't really know why that is, but there's Simplecast. And you can Google for podcast hosting sites, and there's lots of options. But you're going to pay a monthly fee, essentially, for the storage space you're using on somebody else's cloud. And so I think I pay $20 a month, but that's mostly because my episodes are gigantic. It's like an hour, it's sometimes 2 hours long, with lots of audio. It takes up a lot of space. And so you probably don't need to pay that much. And yeah,
Charge for the bandwidth for the downloads? You just pay for the storage?
you just pay for the storage and they'll distribute it for you, and that's it. Yeah. And so, as I said, with something like Libsyn, which is a host, they're going to send it out to all of the major streaming sites, all the apps, and that will show up on people's phones. So if you have like the podcast app on your iPhone, which most people do, or you have the Spotify app, you'll find that if you're subscribed to a podcast, their new episode will just show up at the top of your feed. So that's for people who have an established audience of some kind or have friends that are following along. As I mentioned, when I had a local interview podcast, I had a few thousand loyal listeners that every week when one would come out, it would pop up at the top of their feed. With Your Own Backyard, it was different. It was a global thing. And so every time I would drop an episode, if I checked back later in the day, I'd have 100,000 new downloads or something. You can actually see right here, these are my numbers for this week. I haven't put out an episode in months, but I got 114,000 downloads this week. I got 264,000 downloads this month, and all time I've gotten over 30 million. And so I think somebody asked about reach and how to get the word out about your podcast. I really don't know, and I can only speak to what I did, which is that word of mouth has worked way, way better for me than marketing ever has. So any sort of paid advertisements, anybody who's charging you to get the word out, it hasn't worked in my experience. But sometimes that's your only option. A lot of people will spam. They'll go to sites like YouTube and Reddit and comment and say, go listen to my podcast. It's kind of frowned upon. People don't like to see self-promotion. So it's kind of a catch-22 because you have to get the word out, but people hate people getting the word out. It's like there's something icky about it, right? So I really don't know. Do the best job that you can, make the best podcast that you can, and then tell people about it and in person, and hope that it builds some sort of audience. Also try to find sites. Sites like Reddit are great for, like, they're forums for communication. It's where people go to talk about different topics. Find a subreddit, that's what they're called, these little threads about certain bands you like or whatever it is, and find one that's niche to what you're doing. If you're making a podcast about relationships, go to reddit.com/relationships and tell people I started a podcast and here's what the topic is. You can find that for pretty much anything.
Yeah.
Is there anything before we wrap up here?
We got this. Like, do you do much work with AI? Like,
I don't. Wes does. Wes is pretty familiar with Google Bard.
Oh, yeah.
And ChatGPT and those things. I've actually, so my podcast was about a local missing person case, and it's still very much moving forward. There's still a lot of things happening behind the scenes, and I was speaking to the victim's mother recently, and she was saying she needed to contact an attorney, and you have to sit down, and it's like, I have to type this email, and what am I going to say about this? And she went to ChatGPT and typed, write me a letter to an attorney regarding the Kristen Smart case. And in 30 seconds, it had a form letter for her that was like, hello, I'm working on this case. It Googled the Kristen Smart case. It had facts about, the suspect's name, and all these different things popped up. And then you can edit it from there before you send it off. But these things are they're moving rapidly. I think in January, everybody was laughing about ChatGPT and how awful it was, and it's caught up so quickly.
Yeah.
And so
I think in the world of narration, where I would use it as a tool right now is, if you're not sure what you want your narration to be or what's expected, you can say, can you write, narration for a podcast about 90 seconds that's about this topic, and you can put in the parameters, and it'll, be able to deliver. Where I see it, potentially being a problem is where AI is being used a lot right now, at least on, TikTok and other platforms, is, it can mimic voices really well. So I'm interested to see what that does to journalism and the problems that causes. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm nervous to see what becomes of that. But it is definitely a tool where it's if you give it the parameters, specifically for scripting out things, it'll give you pretty much what you need, and you can do little edits. It's a cool tool in that way to get. It's very good at nailing tone. And I think one thing that Chris did well with Your Own Backyard is that there is like a tone that is expected of like a true crime podcast. And I think you meet that and you subvert it in a really good way. And part of the like show is like how this show is different from other true crime podcasts. But I think if you are like looking to get like the tone of something, whether it's like a dating podcast or like a comedy podcast or something, it'll be able to help you like zero in on that tone like pretty well. And then you can refine it from there. Release, you've talked about not announcing until you're ready. Like, I think one of the things, like from my perspective also as like a viewer that was successful with Your Own Backyard was that the first release was 6 episodes and like done. Like, theoretically, no one was going to get any more. It was like a really concise story. I have definitely tried to do podcasts that I'm like, and this will go on forever, and that gets unbearable like after a certain amount of time, or just like meeting that challenge every week. I second what Chris said, where it's like, the more refined you can get it, if you are like, I'm going to release a 10-episode season, and you do that and leave them wanting more, make those 10 episodes really great, that's always my recommendation. It's just hard to get everyone in the room for like a week. I've done like 2-person podcasts with Chris and like other people, and meeting the challenge of getting an episode out every week. Like the most successful one I did was where, with my friend Adam, it was called Green Eggs and Man, where we read 1 page of Green Eggs and Ham every week and like analyzed it for all the hidden meaning within it. And we recorded 32 episodes before we even released one. So they were all done, and then we didn't have to worry about it. And that was like the best experience because we didn't tell anyone, we did it on our own, and then it was already done when it came time to release it. What else is up here? Sponsors and ads. I know you got lots of thoughts about that.
Sure, yeah. So my podcast didn't use advertisements on purpose, and that was really because in researching and listening to other true crime podcasts, I was always really jarred emotionally when suddenly there would be a mattress ad in the middle of like talking about a murder. Sometimes that can be pretty rough. So I had sort of set a goal up front that I never wanted to have advertisements as part of this. And what I didn't know is that it was going to get millions and millions and millions of downloads, and I could be a very, very successful person right now if I had planned ahead to do it. But I've gotten offers since to insert ads in the finished episodes, and I still won't do it. So I'm just like a weird person. But the average person, basically what you're going to do is if you listen to other podcasts in your genre, you'll pick up on themes of, you know, HelloFresh and Casper Mattress and these podcast advertisements that pop up a lot. You can go to their website and request a sponsorship. They usually have a tab at the top of their website. What they're going to want to see is this. They want to see your numbers, and they're going to pay you based on your numbers. So they might have no interest in advertising with somebody who's getting 10 downloads a week because it's really not going to be beneficial for them. But somebody who's getting big numbers, they're going to up the price that they're willing to pay. I have a friend who hosts a local food podcast that I help her edit, and one of the smart things that she did was she went to local restaurants, wineries, businesses that are relevant to her topic, and she said, you know, I will advertise at the beginning of every episode to go to your restaurant for a certain amount per download. And she did that, and it's worked out really well. And so if you approach people locally as opposed to, you know, these national businesses, that might be a smarter way to go about it. And yeah, again, really consider where you insert your ads, I would say, is the most important part. Some people do what's called a pre-roll, and that's where you do the advertisement before you go into your podcast. That way you can do your whole presentation uninterrupted. But the sponsors will pay more for what's called a mid-roll, and that's where in the middle of your conversation you stop and you say, I'm here to tell you about this. That's because they know more people will be, you know, trapped into listening. You're usually driving or running or something with your AirPods in, and you're not going to fast forward through it, so they'll pay more for that. And then some people will do the ads at the end. Sponsors usually hate that because nobody will sit there after. But so there's different options, and so it really depends on what your subject matter is. If you're kind of a lighthearted podcast and joking around and having a good time, you can, you know, throw in something like that without it being too jarring. But if you're doing something heavy and you want it to be hard hitting, sometimes it's worth weighing your options about what do you want to do with this.
One other option I remember, like if you're like, I have to get something monetized with this podcast, Audible has a similar option to what you were describing, where they will like give you a code that you put into your podcast and like do an ad for, and if a certain number of people use that code when they're like downloading Audible, you'll get a certain amount of money. It is small. I think I got like $15 through using Audible on one of my podcasts like one time because enough people use the download, and I was like, I've made it! So I would say don't go into the podcast game if you're looking to make a lot of money, but if you're looking to make $15. Boy, have you found it. Anything else on here that you feel qualified
There's
to
some
talk
other things
about?
that are a little more specific that I think we'll get to in the questions. So like, you want to move on to
Yeah,
questions?
let's
So
go to
let's just do, if there's questions that you have.
Awesome, thank you so much. Let's move on to questions. Ooh, I'll take this. We will start with, if you have general podcasting questions, we'll give those a little bit of priority, but I'm sure that you have lots of other questions for Chris also. So does anyone have any podcast-centric questions? Yes?
Can we go back to that program where you did all the editing and stuff? Is there a way to like, because like you said, like after your interview, you make notes about like important parts in the interview. Is there a way to like mark those?
Yeah.
In the,
Yes.
How do you do that?
Okay, great question. Okay, so you can see here, and again, this is a microcosm of a big episode, but let's just say instead of being 40 seconds, this was 40 minutes long. I'm just zooming in on the audio here. Production of Fiddler on the Roof at Santa Maria High School. I had heard about Weston through... So let's say that's the part that I really want to get to. So you move your cursor right here, and you go to Edit, Labels, and Add Label at Selection. That's going to put you down here at the bottom, and you can type in Weston, and that's going to stay there. Then when you are looking for it at the end, when you zoom out, you're going to have all these little tabs at the bottom here, and you can scroll over to what specifically you're looking for. It's really helpful. And then also, I've used this tool for if you're editing, let's say, like when I do a season at a time, when I'm helping other people edit a whole season of interviews, sometimes I'll edit them all together in one long timeline. And then what I'll do is I'll add labels that say episode 1 starts here, episode 2 starts here. And then when you're exporting, you can go to Export Labels, and it will split them where those lines are at into individual episodes. So all the audio files will be different. So the labels is like very useful for a lot of different things, but yeah, I find it very helpful. And also, if you have, I didn't title these. Well, here I've got, this one says rainy day here. When you splice, when you do the little splices, here we go, that I talked about, and you do Command I, it will title all these at the top. See, it now says rainy day twice, and I could change this to say something else. So then if you're making splices and you just want to remember like when that splice happens and then it moves into this section, that's also another way to label things.
Is there a limit to how many, I guess, tracks or layers or?
I don't think so. I haven't reached a limit, and I've done unbelievable. Like sometimes it gets really messy, and sometimes you have to shut your whole computer down because what it's doing is each time I make these little splices, it's now saved the previous version I had where they were full as its own file, and the one with it split as a new file. So the reason it does that is so if you make a mistake, you can do Control-Z and you can go back and undo. But the problem with that is it's now taking up double space every time you do an edit. So sometimes you need to close it, save it, close it, and then start it over again in order to sort of let your computer know, I don't want all that old stuff. I'm like, I know what I'm doing, and I'll just get to there as I go.
Are WAV files large files?
Yes. So WAV files, because they're clear and uncompressed, they're going to take up a lot of space. It's usually about 10 megabytes per minute. So if you have a 56-minute episode, it might be 560 megabytes that it's taking up. And then a lot of these hosting sites, once you export everything as a WAV, a lot of these hosting sites want you to make it into an MP3 because it will take up less space on their server. It's really not a problem like once you've got it all edited as WAV, and if you're working with WAVs, when you compress to an MP3 at the end, you really can't tell the difference. The average person usually doesn't know, and that's going to be about 1/10 of the size of a WAV file.
Any other podcast questions? Yes.
So you do a great job of setting scenes when you're approaching people, knocking on the door or something. Do you let people know that you're going to be recording when you approach the house?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have people sign waivers when you interview them?
I don't, and that's only because I haven't hit any trouble with it yet. I understand that other people have, but because mine was local and I knew a lot of the people beforehand, I didn't, but it's probably a good idea, especially if you're planning to interview a lot of people about sensitive subject matter sometimes. I did have, so because I dealt with murder and other kind of heavy subjects, sometimes there were people I interviewed that later on would say, please don't use my audio. And that's kind of an ethical issue because they've already given you permission to record them. You already own the recording, and they really can't do anything about it. But every time I always honored those requests because I thought that's going to keep a good relationship going with people in the future. So also, I had that even when I was doing my local podcast interviewing artists. Sometimes I would sit there for a 2-hour interview with them and we'd have a nice conversation. Like I said, I put them out every Tuesday, so I was on a tight deadline. And Monday they would say, please don't put that episode out. So I'd have to scramble. Lots of times, because I didn't announce ahead of time and I took my time with banking them, I was a few episodes ahead so I could put out the next one and then just scramble to record a new one the following week. But yeah, it can be an issue sometimes. And like you said about approaching while recording, I let people know, I'm going to show up at your house, I'm already going to have my recorder going, but I'm really only going to use that to paint the scene. So anything you say, like, you don't need to be careful with anything you say or anything like that. I like, hearing the engine start. I like the knock on the door, the dog barking, because it really feels like you're there and you're telling the story. But it can be a problem if people were like, I didn't realize you were already recording. So I just let them know, when I show up to your house, I'll already have my recorder rolling, and that's just to set the scene. But once I put on my big equipment, that's, because again, I use this when I'm walking and when I'm doing things on the move. Once we sit down and I get the shotgun mic in your face, then I'll let you know I'm about to start the actual interview with you. And same with phone interviews. I had this question a lot because in my first episode, there's somebody I called and we're talking for a while before he says, are you recording this? And I say, yes. And he goes, okay, that's fine, that's fine. So people said, wait, did you not tell him you were recording? And I had, but he was drunk. So that was the only issue there, was that let people know up front, I'm going to be recording when you call. So just, can you call me at 6? I'll already have the equipment going, so when we start, I'll cut out anything inappropriate, I'll cut out anything that's superfluous, but just so you know, I will already be recording when you call. So I got that question a lot, like, wait, do you not let your subjects know? Like, you do, but sometimes they forget.
Yes.
Format and length. How did you come to decide what would be an appropriate length for each episode? What gives an exposition without truncating anything, without going far too long?
Yeah.
Do your analytics help with that as far as episode length? Or do you just go by feedback on reviews?
I kind of went by just instinct. I do the same thing because I make music, I put out an album. We all kind of have a natural internal clock, and we also have things that we've been programmed to. We're used to a song being about 3.5 minutes long, and when it's longer, you start to feel it dragging, but that's only because that's what you're used to. For a lot of these documentary and true crime podcasts, they're about 45 minutes to an hour long, and when they go longer, you really start to feel it. But the secret is that if you really have engaged your listener by that point, they won't really notice how much time is passing. But even with that, great example is when I was putting out my conclusion of my podcast, I expected it to be one and done, just one episode conclusion and I'm out. And once I started writing the script, I thought, this is 4.5 hours long, and it keeps growing. So there was a point where I thought, I need to find a natural place to end. And again, right around an hour, top out at an hour 20 felt like where people would start to tune out. And I thought what's interesting is people are like I said, knocking my door down, where is your conclusion episode? But I still knew if I put this out as one really long episode, I'm going to lose everyone's interest. So find out naturally where to splice. And I think you just have a good instinct for it. When you listen back to it, I think you can sort of tell where it's I think I'm going to lose people at that point. Sometimes if an interview goes on way too long, some of the bad reviews I got said, does he even have an editor? These interviews go on forever. And a lot of my interviews would go on for 2 or 3 hours, but what made it into the podcast was 2 minutes. And they would still say, why didn't he edit these? So, sometimes people are just annoyed by how long something goes on for. And that's another great place where music and sound effects can help break up the monotony. If somebody's talking for a long time like I'm doing right now, and you're starting to tune out, just dropping in some rain sounds or some music can really help kind of relax the person and take a little break before you go into the next section. Yeah.
Yes?
Is there a time that is determined to be a good time to do that?
Yeah, great question. I've looked into this a lot, and it for whatever reason, it's Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and people usually want them out before they wake up and start their commute. And some people start as early as 5, 6 a.m. So I learned early on, if I don't have a new episode out by the day I promised, by 5 a.m., I'm going to start to get angry messages saying, where is it? You're probably not going to have that problem unless you have a really, really like annoyed audience who's like waiting. But Tuesdays and Wednesdays tend to be, for whatever reason, when people, I think it's because they've started their Monday, they've gone into the work week, and they wake up Tuesday morning and they're like, more of this? Like, I have to go for another 4 days before my weekend? That's the moment they start thinking, I need some entertainment to get me through this. Tuesdays and Wednesdays are great. Dropping on Friday is actually the worst. When you drop on a Friday, I think people tend to save it for the following week. So I've noticed my download numbers would be really low when I dropped an episode on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. But with Your Own Backyard, again, once it went global and it had a big audience, it almost didn't matter when I released it, that people would still jump on it. And I actually found that I put out Your Own Backyard on Monday mornings, which initially is like not a great time, but people started telling me when these episodes come out, it makes my work week. And when they don't come out on Monday, I'm like dying for a new episode. So Monday mornings can work too if people are waiting for your episodes to come out. Yeah, I think having it up before people wake up is usually the rule of thumb, because if people are waiting on a Tuesday and they know that every week this guy's podcast comes out Tuesday, I love listening, but they get in their car and it's not there yet, they'll forget until next week. So I would recommend maybe putting it up at midnight the night before. And the great things about these host sites like Libsyn is when you put your episode up, it says, do you want to publish this immediately or do you want to schedule this? And you can schedule it, so if you have it done on a Monday but you're not putting it out till Tuesday, you can say release it at 12 a.m. And that way it will post automatically to all of the distributors at that point.
Yeah. Midnight's also a good time because if you are like at 11:50 and you have to do one last bit of editing and you go to publish at midnight and it's still not quite right, you still have a couple hours before anyone's like really wanting it. I've definitely been in that scrape a number of times. So midnight usually seems to be like the rule.
Yeah, having it done the night before people are expecting it, if you can swing it. Yeah. Again, the first thing I would recommend is making sure all the volume levels are consistent of each person's microphone. Doing the limiting trick that I talked about where you kind of boost it up, but then you trim off those spikes and keep doing it. Wes and I have very different tones of voice too, so you can see visually in the sound wave. Wes's is a lot more jagged, whereas mine's a lot just kind of rounder and smaller. And so sometimes I have to boost mine or pull his back to get them even. That would be basically what I would recommend. And then if you're talking about background noise, like if you're having a conversation and you have somebody else having a conversation in the background, that's where a more directional mic like these would be important, to have it close to your mouth, pointed directly at your mouth. And these two, I mean, when everybody has their own individual microphone, it cuts down on a lot of background noise, whereas something like this or your cell phone is going to pick up every noise in the room equally. So it's mostly through microphones and volume levels.
One thing also, I don't know if this is your question, but one thing, I've done a lot of conversational podcasts with Chris and other people, and on the content side, like, don't be afraid to edit those as much as you would edit this. I've done conversation podcasts with a friend, and this was my first time doing this, not with Chris. Chris and I have a different dynamic, but with this friend, we would do these conversation podcasts, and they would go on for 2.5 hours, and we would be loath to edit anything out because it's it's our friend, this is our conversations, the natural flow, and then no one wants to listen to a 2.5-hour episode about anything. So I found it's harder, especially with friends, to edit, but also it's just as necessary to find the highs of the conversation. That's one thing that's been on my radar for my next conversation podcast, what I'm going to do next.
It's also really useful if if you're having a conversation with 3 friends, to make sure that the person who's doing the editing is the one who's the least precious and who is kind of good about being an editor. That it's the person who's sort of the least sentimental or who's not going to leave everything in, who doesn't mind clipping out portions that just aren't working or slowing things down. Because there were several times where I'd have conversations with people where a story would just go on so long and I would feel myself tuning out, even if I was the one telling it. And it'd just be just take the whole story. It just doesn't matter. And it can be difficult. So, find the person who has the least feelings.
You know who it is. You're all thinking of your friend with the least feelings right now. Other questions? Yes.
So, what would you suggest for someone who's just starting out with the first episode? They have a general idea of what they're going to discuss. Just how to do the first episode, how things go smoothly.
What kind of podcast is it? What is there?
Leaning towards political.
Okay. And is it like one person, or is it people having a conversation?
People having a conversation, or sometimes there will be episodes where it's just one person.
Yeah. I'd recommend, if it's one person, just having a dedicated microphone that you plug into just a simple recorder, even something like this. Throw a windsock on it so you're not, puffing and making lots of noises, and just talking nice and close to it. Just setting up some kind of space where you're comfortable working. I did mine at my dining room table for a long time, and just having the microphone in front of you, nice and close, and doing as many takes as you need to. As you heard the stumbling and all of that, a lot of times when you're talking, you feel like you should be flowing and things should be making sense, but it just doesn't happen that way, especially when you press the record button. I think if you had your heart rate monitored and you turned on the record button, you'd see that your levels just spike. Everybody gets nervous when it's rolling and you see the numbers. You're gonna take a deep breath, and if you stumble, back up a little bit and start your sentence over again, and you can always cut out those parts in the middle. And yeah, I would say, particularly with the ones where it's just one person talking about a topic, take all the time in the world that you need and just stumble over and over again, and then cut out all the parts in between, and nobody's going to be able to tell the difference.
Yeah. And from a content lens, I would say have some structure, even if it's just for you. Like, if you know, like, the 3 things you want to talk about in that, like, that'll help you, like, all the way. There have been so many times I'm from a microphone, I'm like, I don't have anything to say. And then afterwards, it's like, oh, I know that I had this. Humans just love structure. Even if you have like a segment, like some people recommend starting your podcast the exact same way every single time. Like I listen to a lot of comedy and like D&D podcasts, they'll do that where it's like, hi, here's the situation, here's this thing. We want to see the familiar. So if there's like the bare bones of structure, then you can subvert it, you can do all those things. But
I'm pretty big on bullet points. So like before you sit down with another person or sit down by yourself, just having the bullet points written out, that's like, I don't want this to be so scripted, but I do want to remember what I'm supposed to talk about in order. Just laying that out beforehand can be really helpful, and going over it with the guest first. So I want to talk about this, then we'll go into this, and we'll move into this, and then that way everybody knows up front what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
What do you think about like recording visually and then having it?
You mean like video?
Yeah.
What kind of podcast is it? Is it like where you're sitting down at a table having a conversation?
Yeah.
That's yeah. I would do everything that I explained with the microphones and all that. Never ever use the microphone from the video camera. It will just never get the sound you're looking for. So this is where we talk about the clap. So you get the camera rolling whenever, you get this rolling whenever. When everybody's ready, we're going to do a 1, 2, 3 clap. And then again, like I said, you're going to pull up these, and you see these spikes where there's a clap. A clap is going to be way louder than this, and that's where you line them up each track and make sure that the clap is synced. Then you get rid of the clap, and everything stays in line. So I would always use the audio from a recorder and microphones, and get rid of the audio from the video. Just drop it in under that. So if you're doing like, every Mac or whatever has like iMovie or very simple editing softwares, you can just drop in the video, drop in the audio underneath, and then get rid of the video audio, if that makes sense.
Yes.
What made you want to do a podcast?
It was a local missing persons case that I had grown up hearing about. It was something that had always kind of interested me and made me wonder why nothing was being done about it. And it was really that I set out looking for, I had heard the story growing up, where's a documentary about it? And there was nothing on Netflix or YouTube or anything, and I thought, okay, well, somebody should make a documentary about this. And it just sort of stuck around in my head. At the time I was hosting my interview podcast every week, having conversations with artists and stuff, but this kept nagging at me, like, I want to make a documentary about this case, but I don't know how to do it. And then I kind of looked around and I thought, well, I have all the tools to make an audio documentary. That's why it wasn't a visual thing, because everything that I know is in the audio world. So I just thought, how can I take the tools that I have? Again, I said I read this book. It explains how to get great audio, how to interview people in the field, how to cut these things. Basically, everything I've talked about is in this book in great detail. It's written like a comic book, so it's super easy to read. They walk through every step of what I'm talking about and more. And I read that and I thought, this feels like something I could do. Like if I got the right equipment and I just started asking people questions, and again, because it took place in my own backyard, I had some connections. There was somebody I had talked to that said, I actually went to high school with the suspect, and I said, can I sit down and interview you about it? And then they would recommend me to 2 or 3 people who I actually knew them better than they did. Well, then I'd talk to them, and then word of mouth spread that I was doing the story, and so it was just the curiosity about what had happened and why nobody was talking about it, and then just figuring I can try my own hand at it. And initially, I thought even if I do a really bad job, at least some people will talk about it again, and maybe somebody will come along and do a really good podcast about it. So that was initially setting out, let's just see what happens.
Yes.
I taught at Cal Poly for like 17 years, and I was walking home from being on campus very late one night in the dark, listening to your podcast. And I'm not a person who scares easily, and it was so riveting, and it was actually so important, and I really want to thank you for doing it. And I actually quit Cal Poly in 2021, took a podcasting class, and started trying to think about podcasting. I got a little overwhelmed, so for the last year I've been freelancing for KCBX. So now I'm just about finishing with that, and I feel like I'm actually ready to go, and I know the editing, and I have the equipment. But just thank you for today so much, and thank you for your podcast.
Yeah, you're very welcome. A lot of people that I've spoken to have said, I listened to your podcast and it kind of made me want to start my own, or it made me want to get into podcasting. What advice do you have? And I was just telling Wes about this earlier. I've gotten a lot of emails recently from people who are telling me my podcast changed their entire trajectory in life, that they knew what they wanted to be, they knew what they wanted to do, and then they listened to my podcast and they thought, I want to go into investigation, I want to go into, people want to work for the district attorney's office now, people want to put together documentaries, and they'll email me really very detailed about, I have a local case that I'm interested in, I want to know how you did what you did, and I'll take time and I'll write like a 10-paragraph email in response, and I've never once gotten a response to my response. So I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, but I've been very like maybe overly generous with my email time where I respond to people. So that's why when they asked me if I wanted to do this, I thought this is probably a great opportunity for people who do want to do this, and I can walk you through it, and then maybe read your face and see if did I do anything severely wrong that makes you not want to talk to me again. So yeah. You're welcome.
Other questions? Yes.
I love your theme song, and I want to know where that inspiration for that came from, and has this kind of anticipation and something's coming and this wonderful feel to it.
Yeah.
And how did you come up?
Well, I'm a musician, and so I think very musically. A lot of times when I'm interviewing somebody or something, there's kind of a melody going in my head already of ideas that I have. And when I was writing this, I just thought there has to be something up front that sounds like a kickoff, like something like, here we go, we're going to start investigating. I knew I wanted the cello in there because for me, I just felt like that kind of, it has a heavy emotional tone to it. There's an implication when you hear a cello in a movie or something. I don't know, I picked up an acoustic guitar, I played around for a while, and I came up with the chords for it. And then I probably worked on it for about a year of just adding pieces here and there. I got people to play different parts that, I don't play cello very well, so I hired somebody to do that part for me and stuff, but I dictated to them what I wanted it to sound like. And same for my ending theme song is the same in every episode, and for that one, it was a lot of trying to capture the emotion of longing and searching, which is a very difficult, nuanced position. A lot of true crime podcasts kind of lean pretty heavily into creepy music. A lot of them you listen to, and there's dollhouse, kind of toy piano, just really eerie. And for this story, it just felt overwhelmingly dark. And so that took a long time to settle on what is the emotion I'm searching for and how do I get it. So watching other documentaries and seeing what did they use when they cut to a very emotional scene or when they're trying to get a story across, and trying to learn what I could from those. And when I came up with the end theme is when I really thought, I've got a podcast here, because every episode starting with this and ending with this, there's an emotional journey that you just went on. And so that's what I thought. Thank you.
Yes.
Speaking of mics, I'll just set this
Very sure it's close to
Does anyone else have any other mics that they want to put on this table? We're going for a record. We got at least 10.
Two very quick questions.
Okay.
So first, how did you feel when you found out your podcast helped open this case?
It's hard to pinpoint a moment because it was very slow over time. I think the moment that I think of is the moment that the sheriff's department finally called me and said, we're willing to sit down for an interview with you, because they had heard the episodes I had put out and they thought, okay, like, we're ready to talk. That was the moment where I thought, okay, I've really affected something here. Like, there was some impact. I found out later they were getting lots and lots of phone calls and requests from other media agencies wanting to know more about the story. So I would say that's the moment where I thought, okay, this did something bigger than I thought. And it was surreal, and I'm very slow to process. I'm still processing each piece of what happened because it was also unexpected. But it felt good. It felt like, okay, all the time that I invested into this paid off, because now they're like moving, they're doing stuff.
Perfect. And how did you feel when you finally heard the sentencing?
I just cried a lot. That was the moment in sentencing where the judge directly addressed Paul Flores, and she said, Mr. Flores, you're a cancer to society, and you deserve to spend every day you have left behind bars. It was like the most validating moment of my life, probably, that up to that point, there had been lots of people questioning my motives, the defense attorneys especially. Why did you do this? Why did you pinpoint this person? Where you start to question yourself. It was said a lot in court, he made a podcast with the intention of convicting this man. That was why he put the podcast out. And I kept thinking, wait, I put the podcast out because someone's missing and I want to find her. It had nothing to do with who did it. It was just that everything kept pointing back to this guy. That's the story. And so the moment that the judge told him to his face how she felt, it was like, okay, I'm not crazy and I'm not mistaken. This was a good way to spend my time. You're welcome.
Other questions? Yes.
How are you able to digress after doing the podcast, after each episode, just going through this? I mean, reading or hearing about a story is one thing, but speaking to loved ones, to friends, to the actual family, it's totally another experience. It must have been so surreal for you. How are you able to just digest that, just for everything that went on, and just how much of an impact that you had on the case?
I don't know that I have a good answer to that. It's still a process. It's definitely something that if you're going to set out to make the type of podcast that I did, prepare yourself for how much it's going to change your life. Prepare yourself for the impact that it's going to have on other people. There were even, just small examples of things I said in the first couple of episodes, thinking this is not going to reach that huge of an audience. I mean, in my first episode, I kind of made fun of another podcast that had done this case in a very silly, sort of gruesome way where they just laughed about it a lot, and I thought it was really rude, and so I called them out directly and I played a little clip, and then pretty soon it's like on the news and people were talking about it and they heard about it. So just making sure that you know up front like what you're in for, and especially if you're going to get into like a murder or something so serious like that, there's victims families. I think a lot of true crime podcasts talk about how concerned they are, how much thought they put into the victim and their families, but then you listen and you think there's some insensitive things in there, and there's also just a flippancy to it, and especially when you're doing a new one every week, now you're doing this case, now you're doing this case, you just can't possibly invest that amount of time. So I had the luxury of focusing on one case only for so long, and like my rule, in my living room, we have this big framed print that just says, work hard and be nice to people. And that was like what took me through every step of this, is each person that you meet, you don't really know what they've been through. You don't know why they are the way that they are, or why, you don't really know what's going on. So just be really, really nice to everybody and make sure you connect to them on a personal level. But then, the flip side of that is you get really emotionally invested in them. I made good friends with almost everybody I interviewed, good and bad. Like, no matter what side they were on, everybody I interviewed has stayed in touch with me and become a good friend. So then you see them take the stand in a trial and they break down, and then you're breaking down and crying. Like, I was different from all the other journalists at the trial because I had spent years in this one story, and everybody else there is a professional who does a different story every day. So if you're going to try to do something like this, you got to just prepare yourself for the emotional impact and just make sure you're as nice to people as you can be, because it'll come back on you.
I want to support that too, where it's like, we talk about true crime as a medium, and true crime is being discussed a lot right now about like the ethics and the morality of the true crime genre. And that's what I think is revolutionary about this podcast, is that, like you said, like you are like emotionally invested in a way that most journalists aren't. Like, you are a journalist now, an acclaimed journalist, but you approach this as like a curious friend. Like, I think your first episode and like the theme of searching that you're talking about, like, it's been interesting on my end, just as Chris's friend, to like see like the emotional relationships he's forged and that he's talked about, and to like see even another podcast that I admire know that they are moving on to their next project, and just see that Chris, like, for the last 5 years has like invested his time into this situation. Like you talk about in your first episode, like missing someone you've never met and your relationship with the victim's family. Like, that's what I think is revolutionary about this podcast. So I would say, to like back up what Chris said, Chris's journey was throwing himself into an emotional situation for 5 years, and he is going to live with a lot of these emotions the rest of his life. You don't necessarily want to do that with your podcast. But if you want to, and that is something that you are drawn to do, it takes a really unique person who is strong to do that, and that's what I think is really special about this show.
I just wanted, my wife and I have to leave, but I want to say thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You helped, both of you helped us so much.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
I don't actually listen to podcasts. My friends got me hooked on yours. But I wanted to say, I think that the way you approach the subject, because I've heard other podcasts, like I've heard snippets, is what got me so drawn into it, is because of the care that you were putting into it, the sensitivity you could hear in your voice, and in the way you approach the victim's family. And I was just like, I had to keep listening, because I wanted to know, because I felt like it was so genuine. Like some of the like YouTube videos I've watched on true crime and stuff like that, it's not as genuine, and it doesn't sound as like, oh, they're doing it for the family. And I wanted to say that it was really amazing listening to your thing. Like, I binge listened to it for like several weeks, but yeah.
Thank you. It's not advice that a lot of people will take to heart unless they're already this type of person, but I always tell them, like, the first rule should be that you're doing this for the right reasons. And I have a feeling that the majority of people who go into this field are doing it for the wrong reasons. It's also another reason, I don't consider podcaster as like my occupation. I don't consider myself a podcaster at all. I just made a podcast that did a thing, but I still have the impulse to, help other victims and help people find their missing loved ones and try to solve murders for them. But I don't have the skill set to do that every time. What I have the skill set to do is tell a story. And so I just thought, well, going into this, I already know that this is not my career, and it's not something I'm hoping to like bank on or make it big. I just really, really, really want to help. And I don't know that a lot of people who go into this have that intention. And I think maybe the biggest takeaway should be that a lot of people who do have that impulse, that want to do this for the right reasons and really, really want to help, but are afraid to, or they have another line of work that they're in, is just start like earnestly working on it. Just start putting it together. Like, lay it out on paper, see what it looks like, see what your episodes look like, and just give it a shot, because you doing it for the right reasons is 1,000 times better than all the people who keep doing it every week for the wrong reasons.
I saw your hand over here.
Yeah, I want to second that. I did not plan on wearing Cal Poly attire. I went to the girls' volleyball game. I walked in, I'm like, oh, wow, I'm wearing Cal Poly attire. Anyway, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I work in admin at Cal Poly, and so I'm looking at the dorms every day. I'm walking that walk that you so eloquently articulated, and it's like, that's my walk from the structure. And it's been a journey to listen to it. I thank you so much for exactly what they said, because when we were I was waiting with bated breath for that one, that next episode.
Yeah.
I tried looking around, is there anything else? Is there anything else to fill in? And it was just very, I literally stopped. I couldn't even listen anymore when you got to the ones that were just lighthearted or throwing all the ads in and all the things. It's like your sincerity, like your heart was so in this, obviously. You gave up your whole life, which is just, I mean, the Smart family must be forever grateful. And it, yeah, I couldn't put it down. I've listened to it repeatedly. So thank you for doing what you did. I was one of those that was out on cliffs at Dinosaur Caves when the verdict came in. We were literally all standing there on, right by Kristen's bench, and it was euphoric. And I hope, gosh, I just hope this. I know you said the story isn't over yet. It's still going, and I just hope that we get to the end to where they can get some resolution.
Yeah.
To that point, is your plan to put any more out? Because it's still kind of an ongoing investigation, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't have the body yet.
Right.
So, is your plan to continue to do that?
Yeah, and because, like I said, because I'm not pursuing this as a career, I sort of have the luxury of sitting on it, and I sort of stick by that rule that I think between maybe 2019 and 2020, there was a portion where like 9 months passed and I had no new episodes out, but I was working on it the entire time. And it just didn't feel like necessary, and it also didn't feel like the information was finished. It was like, this episode is still being pieced together. And so I'm doing the same thing right now. Every day, there's something involving this case that I'm involved with. I'm working on it behind the scenes. There's a lot of new detectives that are working on it that weren't there a few years ago, and that's promising. And there's always tips coming in still. A lot of them are things that I'm already familiar with, or things that have been thoroughly looked into or debunked that are, they're trying, but it's already, been a done deal. But there's always new ones that are like, that's something I haven't considered yet, or something I haven't pursued. I always look into those. And so, yeah, my plan is to just be really quiet for a long time until it's important to speak up again and tell a story. So I'm sort of collecting.
Well, it's good to hear that you're still involved all along the way, because we all want that, for sure. And
Thank you.
It created quite a perspective, because I walk around campus, I have a daughter myself, and I look at she doesn't know the details, she knows high level, because the details are too much at 12, but it's like, this is an example. She knows, she walked home from a party, it's been a good teaching, what came of this was a good teaching tool.
Yeah.
And just looking around campus and watching these girls, it's just like, oh, please listen, please take it to heart, because it happened right here.
Right.
It can happen then, it could happen now, be careful with your drinks, all the things, so.
Yeah. I'm not connected to Cal Poly in any way, and I don't really keep up with, I don't know anybody who goes right now, but it must have been student move-in week this last week, and I only know because I got this wave of new emails from moms telling me on the drive to Cal Poly, I made my daughter listen to your whole podcast, and it's been like a bonding experience. Yeah, a lot of mothers and daughters seem to have bonded over listening to it together and then discussing it. Don't go to a party without a friend. Don't leave the party without a friend. Watch out for other people and things like that. And so, yeah, without even knowing, I just got this wave of new emails, and I thought they must have moved in new students, and yeah.
Thursday, Friday, and now it's WOW week, so it's chaos.
Yeah.
And it's volleyball season. Games, tournaments. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? I think we got time for one or two more if there are any. Yes?
Have you been approached to have a documentary done about what your podcast, your involvement with the film?
Yes, constantly. That started very early on. It's been going on for probably 2 or 3 years now. I was in an episode, or a few episodes of Dateline. I was on a few episodes of 48 Hours, and then 2020. So those are all like the major network documentaries. But then there are people who want to make a dedicated docuseries. But a lot of the people, when they approach me, they sort of just want to retell the exact same story I told with visuals, which to me feels like a kind of a waste of time. And it's also not moving the ball forward. Like, it's not helping this case anymore. And so I've left that all up to the Smart family. I've just told them, anything you want to pursue, I'd be happy to be a consultant or walk people through it. I've done a lot of work with other people who are trying to investigate this or trying to move things forward in the legal sense, where I just have this gigantic timeline I piece together, and I'll just sit down with them and walk them through. But as far as like a documentary, I've been pursued by every major network you can imagine, and I just don't have any interest in it until it feels like it's valuable.
Anything else? Yes.
Going back to the whole Cal Poly thing, is there any other Cal Poly students in this room? Okay, because I am, and I listened to your podcast as a first year, as I was going through it, you know, and a lot of my goal with my podcast is kind of to spread what you were talking about, you know, be safe, don't go alone, you know, and so it's interesting that this conversation has kind of tied that all together for me. It makes me want to continue.
I also was, like you had said early on, just like not when someone asked why you started. We moved to Central Coast in 2009, and I'll never, I mean, like, one of my earliest memories was seeing the sign of this missing girl. And it's just like, really? And then when it was still there, and still there, and still there, I'm like, why isn't anybody doing anything, you know? So thank you for being that person that did something, because it gnawed at me as I drive through the village, and it just keeps getting at that time, the sign kept wearing and wearing and wearing, and it's like, seriously, this girl is still missing, because she's young and blonde, and I have a young blonde daughter now, and it's like, why? Like, so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things when I do respond to emails very long-winded and give them all these things.
Don't stop that, by the way.
Yeah, I will.
I'll be one to say that I would be honored to have that, for you
Yeah.
to have taken that amount of time. So maybe people are just so like, whoa, he really did
So-
respond. They're like, you know, shell-shocked or shocked or whatever.
Right.
Don't keep giving your
Okay.
heart, because that's how this whole podcast worked. Because
Right.
you gave from your heart, and you did what you felt wanted to share.
Yeah.
With sincerity and so genuine.
Well, my intention in those responses, it has always been, I wish that the lesson that people would take away from my podcast is that you have the ability to do this too. Because like I said, this isn't something I pursued as a career. I'm not a trained journalist. I'm not a trained investigator. I'm a trained musician, and that's really, you know, not helpful at all. But I gave it a shot, and like it had a massive impact, and it moved a lot of things forward. It changed a lot of people's lives. And so instead of, you know, the takeaway being, well, now are you going to go on to have a career or be famous or whatever? No, I hope that you will do the same thing in your own communities. There's other missing people. There's other murders that are unsolved. And if, you know, if I'm qualified to do it, then you're qualified to do it. Pick up this equipment, like try, just give it a shot, reach out to a family. What I've learned is that any family with a missing loved one or a murdered, unsolved murder in their family, they always want to talk about it. And people are afraid to ask them about it sometimes because they don't want to come off insensitive or they don't want to open that wound, but it's always open. They're waiting to share their story. So a lot of times, I didn't promise the Smart family anything up front. I just said, I really want to tell your daughter's story. And they said yes. So I didn't promise that I would solve it. I didn't promise that I would get somebody put in prison. It was just like, I would like to tell this. So I would hope more people would take my example and just say, well, if he did it, I can do it too.
And I'm sure you've inspired many, because you've always been humble pie. You've always said, I don't know what I'm doing. You know, like, you've always come across that way, and so it's like, I'm sure you have a ripple effect impact on this country. We can do it too. If he did it, we can do it too, because of that humility.
Thank you.
Thank you. Because there's a lot, I bet you there could be a lot more cases. I mean, that will be solved because this podcast inspired them to, well, I want to do that.
Sure.
You know, the missing persons is endless, and it's wild to me, like how is it?
Right. Well, and what I've learned is that police departments can only dedicate a certain amount of time to each case. And so when you have somebody who's willing to spend this much time and just say, in my spare time, because I was working, a job while I was starting this. The first year or so of research, I was going to work and then coming home and doing this in my spare time. So I didn't finally quit my job until I thought, I've got enough here that I can make a pretty decent documentary, and if I don't quit now, I'm never going to pursue it. And I just knew I would just stay working there forever. And I thought this could be bigger.
planning ahead, knowing for a full year that I was going to be quitting my job, and dating and living with somebody who makes way more money than I do. But knowing ahead of time that this was going to be the plunge, we had many conversations. I want to try this. It is going to be rough for a while. I mean, can we do this? And she very strongly encouraged me to do it. And then what I found out is just through having a donation tab on my website, it's like it's not required at all, but if you want to throw a few bucks at me for batteries or coffee, I'd appreciate it. And it's kept me afloat for this long. It's just still been just purely donation based. Yeah.
Awesome. We are at the end of our time, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We hope it was helpful. Feel free to take pictures of this or anything else, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.